Hi, everybody. My name is Bill French. My presentation is called Mobilizing America to Promote Climate Security. Our house is on fire. This conference has been eloquent on that. My presentation is an outlier. It's rooted in ethical theory, national security studies, and American history. It's informed by Lester Brown's stress that we must mobilize to save civilization. Nations apply energy through budgets, through national spending, to mobilize action. Throwing money really helps. There's a double standard of threat perception. Only military threats count as national security threats. The history of wars in the 20th century prepared us well to be always observant for future possible military threats. The prudence principle stresses prepare for the worst case scenario. President Eisenhower warned about overspending on military due to the pushing and lobbying of the military-industrial complex. Yet, for many, ecological threats are not seen as genuine national security threats. So for many, the worst case scenario is denied. Even the reality of climate change is denied. We wish Eisenhower had warned us about the big coal and big oil interests and how they might be funding a decades-long climate change denial campaign. 2 points in a proposal. First, I want to sketch the history of thinking about the war on nature. In 1910, a war on nature in America seemed to Americans to be a good idea. Now we know nature is making war back on us for our attack on it. Secondly, the way America mobilized for World War II illustrates what America is capable of doing to reduce the mounting threat of climate disruption. Proposal: we need to commit $1 trillion per year to fund climate security. This is roughly equal to our annual military spending budget. William James in 1910 wrote an essay in which he thought that a war on nature is good. War between nations is bad, so we had to end that war. But he felt that we need a war substitute, a moral equivalent, to continue to cultivate the moral virtues that warfare historically sustains in society: courage, discipline, a willingness to sacrifice for the common good. He was entranced by the feats of building the Panama Canal. He envisioned youth brigades from all nations joined in a common endeavor, namely the immemorial war against nature. They would chop forests, build roads, make society better. The assumptions are interesting, and so it illustrates the common sense of his day that a war on nature would be a good thing. It would be a bloodless war with no human casualties. Only human society is active. The natural world is passive, a vast and stable given. Nature will take whatever we dish out. The world wars absorbed our attention so greatly, but after World War II, we began to focus as a global society on killer pollution cases, air pollution, water pollution, now nuclear radiation pollution. And ecologists began to get frustrated that we weren't taking ecological concerns with sufficient seriousness. And so rising voices of ecologists began to warn, wait a minute, a war on nature is bad, and we're making war on nature. Barry Commoner argued this in his 1990 book, Making Peace with the Planet, to end our war with the planet. A second chapter of this, that nature itself is a superpower, and thus making war on nature, you're making war on a superpower, and that's really, really bad. This was the voice of nuclear winter analysts in 1983, 84, that period, led by Carl Sagan and others. They were interested in how a popular theory, a very interesting theory of asteroid impact causing the death of the eon of the dinosaurs, was begun by Walter Alvarez, a geologist looking at this strata near Gubbio, Italy. And below that, a line with lots of iridium, one found lots of fossils of forams. And then above that strata line, a great die-off of forams. This led Walter and his father, Luis Alvarez, to argue an extraterrestrial cause of the extinction. And Walter popularized this in hypothesizing that a great asteroid, 6 miles, 8 miles wide, crashed into the Earth, and this triggered a flash of heat that incinerated many life forms, but also then a massive global cooling period of cloud cover that stopped photosynthesis. And this was corroborated by other findings of iridium around the world, and then looking at geological sightings, finding a great crater on the Yucatan Peninsula seemed to be corroborations of the Alvarez impact hypothesis. So asteroids and powerful events were in the air, and that led Carl Sagan and a number of other scientists to begin to ask, well, by an analogy, if an asteroid killed off the dinosaurs, then what might a nuclear war do, ecologically speaking? And so Sagan and his team dug into computer modeling. Sagan wrote in Foreign Affairs, A Nuclear War and Climatic Catastrophe, A Nuclear Winter. So the notion of an ecological impact of a massive global cooling after a nuclear war was being investigated and discussed by American and Russian Chinese scientists. Case 17, a 10 megaton exchange. 100 days after that case, they guessed that global temperature could be roughly minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a year, we would only be getting up to global average temperature of around 32 degrees. This could wipe out 2 growing seasons. They envisioned that there's a doomsday threshold. Anywhere from 500 to 2,000 nuclear blasts could wipe out a lot of people initially, but then as the cloud cover passed around the world, it plunge us into a deep freeze that could cripple 2 growing seasons and lead to the extinction of humanity. Sagan didn't say it, but it seemed clear that they're saying that United States and Russia aren't the only superpowers. If the targeted country did not respond with a second strike, the nature of that country, the dust and smoke of that country, and the forests of that country would react and would cover the globe with darkening skies and plunging the globe into a global cooling, a nuclear winter. So that nature itself is a superpower. And in strategic terms, nature itself has a retaliatory capacity against humanity's abuse. And this is true for a nuclear war, and it's true for mounting climate disruption. Bill McKibben is one of our most important climate activists and writers of journal articles. He argues in Climate Change Now, we see that nature is now making war back on us. In A World at War, essay in the Republic. He says, we're under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. Carbon and methane now represent the deadliest enemy of all time, the first force fully capable of harrying, scattering, and impoverishing our entire civilization. Carbon and methane are seizing physical territories, sowing havoc and panic, racking up casualties, and even destabilizing governments. It's not that global warming is like a world war, it is a world war. Defeating the Nazis required building factories, big factories, really, really fast. I agree with McKibben. Our mobilization for World War II illustrates how we must engage mounting climate change. Tom Brokaw called the World War II generation of Americans the greatest generation because they stepped up to the challenge. FDR reached out to Bill Knudsen, the president of General Motors, to head up the National Defense Advisory Commission. FDR's New Deal had triggered lots of anger among corporate leaders, and his cabinet distrust corporations and the corporate profits that flowed during World War I. Knudsen knew the power of industrial assembly line production, and he knew everybody in Detroit. Rapid mobilization was a joint venture between big government and big corporations. Knudsen had a sense of urgency because he had visited Europe to check on General Motors factories, and he saw Germany's rush to war. He persuaded FDR to cut the process of seeking competitive bids from a number of companies because it's too slow. He persuaded FDR that if the government would pay for the cost of any new needed factories, this would jumpstart corporate buy-in. He persuaded FDR to agree that the government would reimburse all corporate costs and guarantee a 7% profit on top of that. This was known as cost plus. The jolt, Pearl Harbor. The reaction, mass mobilization, mass production. Detroit becomes the arsenal of democracy. Check out the light green line. This is the surge, the industrial surge of the United States coming online for war. This marks tank production beginning in 1941, surging to a peak in 1943. Over the war, we produced almost 100,000 tanks, second only to the USSR. This is the way we won the war. Our military spending surged up to consuming 41 to 43% of our GDP. We can mobilize like that in a time of ecological emergency. We did it before. This is the peak of national defense spending, the surge in World War II. But look at the spending across the Cold War was maintained at 8 to 10% of our GDP. That's what we thought was smart to spend. Mobilization costs money, and to pay for it, FDR asked the American public, the American wealthy, to pay a top marginal tax rate of 94% on income above $250,000. In today's dollars, it would be roughly on income above $2 million. There's the peak, top marginal rate, 94%. Throughout the Cold War, we sustained it at 70%. We dropped it down to 40%, then to 39%. Then Mr. Trump dropped it to 37%. Corporate taxes, World War II, 40%. We kicked it up to roughly 50% across the Cold War period, then down to 35%. It plateaued, and then more recently, Mr. Trump dropped it to 21%. The justification for expanding income taxes was, well, we're drafting civilians to serve in the armed forces. It only seems fair to ask our wealthy to pitch in and pay higher taxes. U.S. military spending currently spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. Trump proposed $750 billion for our security budget. A better analysis, I think, adds in other budgets that are often separated out so we can't see them and can't grasp them. But we're spending roughly $1 trillion per year on defense spending. The nation estimates that it's really 1.25 trillion, even higher. But while we're spending in absolute numbers a huge amount, our economy has grown so vastly that that huge military spending only counts at is equal to roughly 3 to 4% of our GDP. So my proposal is the U.S. should commit to a climate security budget equal to the scale of our annual military spending. Actually, I think we should cut our military spending significantly and shift it to climate security, but that's a tough sell. So our current defense spending of $1 trillion per year cashes out about 4.7% of our GDP. So adding a second trillion for climate security might push our total national security spending to 9.5% of our GDP. It's a tough sell politically, perhaps, but it's readily doable. One can't say that it's impossible because the U.S. sustained higher levels of security spending across World War I and the decades of the Cold War. Putting numbers out there is important. Most people have no clue about the scale of our military spending or about the costs climate change is imposing on us. People with money who have stocks focus on the Dow. Where's the stock market? Drivers across America daily focus on gas station prices for gasoline. These are numbers that our society focuses on. We need new numbers to focus on. How could we pay for this? Well, we'd pay for it the way FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy paid for defense spending across World War I and the Cold War. We can move 21% back up to 40%, 35% or 40%. Jeff Bezos his income has stood at $81,000 per year. Now, his vast wealth is sheltered in other tricky areas to reduce his income taxes. Trump's new tax laws brought in a vast boom for America's wealthy class and also a boom for corporations. If we wanted to kick spending up to 40% of GDP and apply that to climate disruption, we could commit about 8.4 trillion per year. But that's a real tough sell. So a commitment to pay 1 trillion per year to engage climate disruption is modest in comparison. This is the old view of national security, and an ecologically informed understanding of national security looks like this and this. This is fundamentally a political and policy issue and the greatest moral issue of our age. It requires the ramping up of non-carbon emitting power sources and the rapid winding down of fossil fuel consumption. America and all other countries need to apply our energies and national wealth to help in this great effort. America bears a huge burden of responsibility for our cumulative historical contribution to atmospheric carbon buildup. Thomas Berry, a Catholic priest and geologian, has rightly called this the great work of our age. Thank you all very much. Hope you have a good conference.